unlike the last time I spoke, which was on my book, Anti-Nazi Germans, I'm not speaking today primarily about resistance within Germany, but about socialists, anti-Nazis who had to flee from Germany because of their resistance, who came to Britain. And I'm also going to be talking about a group of people who really are not known about, who were people who in one way or another worked with the British forces, and then in some Germans anti-Nazis who worked with the British forces, and then in some cases, in fact, fought against them. And I mean, this is an area of research which I wish I had started 20 years ago rather than 2 years ago. So that, this is not as deep in analysis as it might be. And so what the ebooks really are stories, they're biographies, they're stories about, extraordinary men and women. And I'm hoping that my work will act as some sort of stepping stone for others to develop on it. I mean, there are about 50 biographies altogether in the 3 ebooks. There are a few Social Democrats, lots of communists because they were the largest group, a few Trotskyists and a few others. And I'm just going to be talking about a few people, a few left-wing refugees, starting off by people who came to Britain, and using them to illustrate different political tendencies in terms of how to organize against Nazism when you are no longer within Germany. Okay, that's the introduction. It's only a guesstimate, but as late as 1940, it's been calculated that there were only about 5,000 political refugees in Britain. There was a wide and often acrimonious divergence of opinion amongst them, tragically divergent anyway, as to how best to organize against the Nazi regime in a foreign land. I mean, most of the refugees were more ferociously anti-Nazis than many in the UK, or many, people who were born here. So the first person I want to look at is somebody called Margaret Jeweler. And I chose her for a number of reasons. She was one of the few activist women, because it's relatively easy to find out about her, which certainly isn't always the case, because she wrote an autobiography with the help of Maggie Wren, and because, unlike so many of the exiles or refugees, she remained in Britain and remained an activist. She's also distinctive because she joined British left organizations rather than exile groups. Very few of the activist refugees did this, although that was partly because the British Communist Party wanted to keep refugee members and supporters in distinct exile organizations. Anyway, in Germany, Jeweler's first job was to work for Willy Münzenberg's International Workers' Relief Fund. She soon joined the KPD, that's the Communist Party, but she rapidly became critical of the Stalinization of the USSR. And in early 1933, she joined the left opposition, the KPO, which was a left breakaway from the KPD, from the communists, and which was, unlike the KPD at that point, in favor of the United Front. And she was very active in the anti-Nazi underground and had to flee, and under the cover of a skiing trip, she escaped to Prague. She got into the UK around 1937 from France and became active in the Socialist Anti-War Front, a group organized by the Revolutionary Socialist League, which had been formed by the merger of the Marxist League led by Harry Wicks and the Marxist group led by C.L.R. James. I mention that because some people here will know of them or know them. Reg Grove was its main theoretician, analyzing the war as a product of imperialist rivalry, just like the First World War. Workers should oppose the war and fight for wage increases, control over prices and profits, and the socialization of industry. Jeweler was part of the faction that then joined the Independent Labour Party, and she became involved in a magazine, Free Expression, which was a Trotskyist journal within the ILP, which carried material by Trotsky. But there never was a unified Trotskyist line, what position to take about the Second World War. Indeed, some Trotskyists argued instead of the Jeweler line, for agitating within the armed forces, in other words, not opposing conscription. Unlike most of the anti-Nazi activist refugees who had political motives for returning to East or West Germany, Jeweler had no such political alignments and stayed in the UK. In her final decades, she became active in SWP. The next person is Karl Grohl, who is commonly known as Stanislas Retzlau. My apologies if I'm saying that wrong. Another of the handful of refugees in the UK who was sympathetic to Trotskyism, but his career illustrates a very different trajectory from Jeweler's. Initially a foundry worker, he was involved with both the Bavarian Soviets of 1918-19 and the 1919 Berlin Uprising. But one of the things I found was how many of these German refugees actually had been active right from the beginning. Anyway, he became a leading member of the Spartacists, joined the USPD, was a founder member of the Communists, the KPD, and prominent in the Red Front. He became a full-time functionary and head of the KPD's illegal paramilitary apparatus. About more could be said. But then, highly critical of the Comintern's third period sectarianism, he became sympathetic to Trotskyism. He escaped to France and started to work for the Deuxième Bureau, France's external military intelligence agency, and then moved on to collaborating with D Branch, which was the sabotage grouping under MI5. He became a key coordinator, running an extensive underground network in Switzerland, but probably also in Germany and Austria, gathered military information from Germany, and supposedly, I don't know if it's true, built up a network of around 50,000 underground anti-Nazi workers. We're still talking about before 1939 here. France was becoming an increasingly difficult and dangerous place for an anti-Nazi refugee, and he was interned. After many hiccups, he was released, apparently after British, probably MI5 intervention, and escaped, probably on foot, through France, Spain, and Portugal. Once in Britain in around 1940, he worked with the British Ministry of Interior and resumed contact with his extensive underground European network. He also worked for SOE during 1941-42 in the sabotage section, but they dismissed him because of his other clandestine activities. Much ink has been spilled over contested explanations of the role of SOE, the Special Operations Executive. Unusually, SOE's role was to work from beneath, to promote sabotage and subversion in enemy-occupied territory, and to establish a nucleus of trained men and women to work with local resistance groups. Thus, SOE balanced on the cusp of two parallel wars. On the one hand, there was the war between Germany and the Allies, which could be seen, in fact, as an imperialist war, and the popular war, people fighting against Nazism from the base, but also at times fighting against their own right-wing rulers, as we shall see in Greece. This ambiguity facilitated left-wing Germans, such as Retzlau, who one might have expected to see the British bourgeois state as the class enemy, nevertheless finding justification for collaborating with them. Some of the leadership of SOE, mainly establishment figures, were willing or even enthusiastic to draw on the left wing of the exiled community, usually not communists, but the ISK grouping and Berthelot's ISK network. The ISK the Internationale Sozialistische Kampfbund, or International Socialist Militant League, were a left breakaway from the SPD, the Social Democrats, pro-United Front, and strongly anti-Nazi. So SOE's recruiting of them to grow underground in Germany at the advantage they could pass as German citizens, and were generally not sympathetic to the Soviet Union. I must add that as the war came towards its end, SOE backed away rapidly from any cooperation with lefties in Britain or elsewhere. Retzlau, at the same time that he was working for the secret state, founded the tiny German Revolutionary Socialist League, a part of the Trotskyist Fourth International. It, which actually means him, I think it had a membership of about 6 people, produced a clear set of demands for a post-war socialist Germany, which unusually raised the demand in 1942 for all Nazis to be removed from their positions after the war. He was also active in the Fight for Freedom group in Britain, which argued the Nazis could only be defeated from outside as internal resistance had failed, though he was way to the left of many of the members of the Fight for Freedom group. The exiles in the UK, both KPD and SPD, he argued, were irrelevant or had become irrelevant to defeating Nazism. And for anyone interested in these sectarian struggles, he appears to have become interested in a small socialist group called Neue Beginnen, but they thought him to be a KPD spy. I mean, that is just so typical. Anyway, in 1946, Retzlau left the UK for the French zone of Germany, then moved back to Saarbrücken, where he became a Social Democrat. But the Social Democrats then expelled him, and he moved to Frankfurt, where he died in 1979. Unlike Margaret Jeweler, Retzlau was willing to ally with the British state as a way of defeating the Nazis. He no longer believed the Nazis could be overthrown from within Germany. And the British left, in particular the Labour Party, but also many in the Communist Party, had already aligned themselves with the British state's efforts to defeat Germany. Maybe Retzlau's moving to the west rather than East Germany, and this is my conjecture, was a result of his willingness to cooperate with the British secret state, but maybe equally his earlier criticisms of Stalinism precluded his going back to the East. I want to briefly mention Verna Layman because he tried and failed to find refuge in Britain. The image of Britain as a welcoming country is very far from the case. I mean, Layman's history is extraordinary. He was an active anti-Nazi, a member of the KPD and the Red Navy section of the Red Front. He fled in April 1933, went to sea, deserted, and joined the extraordinary group of German anti-Nazi seafarers in Antwerp, a part of the International Transport Workers' Federation. In September 1936, Layman went to fight with the Durruti column in Spain. He later returned to Belgium and again had to flee, but he was banned from disembarking from the ship he was on in London by the police. After many other attempts to keep ahead of the Nazis and their collaborators, he was killed in the headquarters of terror of the Reich Security main office in Berlin in 1941, aged 37. He was not the only refugee whom the British authorities attempted to prevent landing. But though the Labour Party kept a long distance from the refugees, a few individual Labour MPs did help. The leading example was Ellen Wilkinson, without whom Gerhard Hinze, who first fled from Germany to the USSR, probably Hans Kahler, another German-Spanish Civil War veteran, and Wilhelm Können, a leading German communist, would not have got into Britain. And I'm just going to spend a moment about Können, because he had a remarkable history. He too had helped organize the provisional regional workers in central Germany in 1918, 1919. He had organized against the Kapp Putsch. He became a KPD Reichstag deputy. And when he attempted to get into Britain, whether it was because of that or not, he was refused permission, and he tried a few times, and Wilkinson finally got him in. Then he was taken into custody as an enemy alien in 1940 and sent to Canada, but brought back to the Isle of Man in December 41. I mean, what a way to treat somebody who's just escaped the Nazis. Rathbone again interceded on his behalf, and he was released from internment, having given the assurance, which was common, that he would not be politically involved. However, like so many others, he then became embroiled in heated disputes within the exile community, especially around the Fight for Freedom group, on how best to defeat Germany. My second ebook is about Hans Jahn. I'm just going to take a gulp of water. Jahn, rather, a German trade union bureaucrat who represents the very best of trade union bureaucracy. Unlike so many German trade union leaders, he took defending his members' rights against the Nazi offensive sufficiently seriously to commit to building an anti-Nazi underground amongst rank-and-file German railway workers. Originally a fireman, then a smelter on the railways, he became the secretary of the Union of Railway Workers in Germany. Much later, he was to say that one of the greatest tragedies is that German unions did not fight to prevent Hitler, notice he uses the word Hitler, prevent Hitler taking power in 1933. Sympathetic to the SPD, the Social Democrats, his anti-Nazi activities also indicate there was a serious organized resistance in Germany outside the KPD network. Despite the attempts by leading trade union bureaucrats to collude with the early Nazi government, trade unions were banned on the 2nd of May 1933, and many trade union leaders imprisoned. But the illegal work of the railway union continued. In May 33, I love this, Jahn seized 17,000 index cards. He basically got to them before the Gestapo did. And then he selected some of them, particularly people he knew, and started to build up a secret network and establishing contacts. And I mean, it was amazing. I mean, this network distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, papers, newsletters. Rail workers deposited hundreds of smuggled pamphlets and underground papers in the sleeping cars of express trains. Behind window shutters are hidden in secret compartments of suitcases. The General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation, under the chair Adolf Fimmen, provided extensive financial and logistical support. By the spring of 1935, Jahn had contact with around 150 secret bases in 17 districts, especially along the railway lines. But one must beware overestimating resistance activities. In practice, as Dieter Nellis suggests, many in the railway unions and the ITF, while being strongly anti-Nazi, were not actively involved in underground work. And then, of course, the Gestapo in 35 uncovered Jahn's network, arrested Jahn for the 3rd time. He was amazingly released, fled to Amsterdam, or Czechoslovakia, Amsterdam, continued to organize, apparently organizing a few derailments and other forms of sabotage in Germany, continued fleeing, and then finally, in 1940, he reached London. And he continued to organize here, but he was now largely cut off from his base and more distant and isolated from what remained of the anti-Nazi struggle in Germany. He became rather top-heavy in his activities. He set up a group of German trade union refugees, which later affiliated to the National Group of German Labor Unionists in Britain, and tried to organize, didn't succeed, a unified German trade union confederation to make plans for after the war had ended. Interesting. An international railwaymen's conference was held in London in September 43, whose aim was the development again of a post-war plan to safeguard the interests of German workers. And it was remarkably attended by 46 trade unionists from 14 European countries. Jahn also represented the ISK, a left breakaway from the SPD, and along with other ISK members or ex-members such as Hilda Meisel, Willy Eichler, and Mary Saran, continued to campaign over support for refugees from Spain and Germany and to try to get them into Britain. Unlike some of the refugees whom I've included in my ebooks, he celebrated when British bombs fell on German cities and called for more. So that was a very particular perspective. Like Retzlau, Jahn and some other members of ISK worked with SOE. Jahn, while passing through France, well, fleeing through France, had been put in touch with the SOE by another extraordinary figure, I mentioned him earlier, René Berthollet from Switzerland, a key organizer and financier of underground couriers, who, unlike most of the British establishment, understood how important German trade unionists could be to the resistance. As late as September 1943, the International Federation of Transport Workers issued an extraordinary call for sabotage, 1943, addressed to German railway workers, and a sign of Jahn's dual.
Yeah. Can you put the oven on at 7 o'clock?
Yeah.
I've left a note on the table.
A sign of Jahn's dual strategy. In 1944, Jahn, in collaboration with the SOE and the OSS, that's the American equivalent of SOE, tried to infiltrate exiled Union cadres who were in Britain into Germany and cooperated in acts of sabotage in German-occupied northern Italy. So he was riding both horses. Jahn returned to Germany after the war, joined the SPD, and became a leading anti-communist and cold warrior. Okay, on to my third ebook. German refugees cooperated with the British state in a variety of ways. Someone suspects more voluntarily than others. One largely unknown example of cooperation were the 100 or so refugees, some German, who joined the 10th Inter-Allied Commandos, or X-Troop, set up by Churchill specifically to absorb foreign volunteers in Britain, frequently in the so-called Pioneer Corps. They didn't want to be in the Pioneer Corps, but they weren't being used elsewhere, and who in X-Troop encountered some of the worst fighting of the war in Europe. Useful as German speakers, their role included encouraging German soldiers to surrender in frequently hair-raising circumstances. But many refugees who worked alongside the British never lived in Britain. One such group, who have largely disappeared from history, are the Germans who fought with the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, then escaped into France, and then were sent by the French government to hellish POW, prisoner of war camps in Algeria. Though Britain's freeing of the camps in 1944 was not their primary purpose, I look in this book at 10 Germans, mostly Spanish Civil War veterans, who were able to get out of the camps by volunteering to fight with the British. I really tried to find out what volunteering meant, and I just couldn't find the information. But anyway, they technically volunteered to fight with the British, so they got out of the camps. It is also almost unknown that there were tens of thousands of deserters from the Wehrmacht. Deserters covers a very wide range of motivation, but what I'm interested in are those who deserted for political reasons. It's inevitably hard to find any reliable estimates, but desertion occurred wherever the German army fought. As we're about to see, there were many hundreds of deserters from the 999 battalions, the German penal battalions, often called death battalions, where about 2/3 were conscripted political opponents of the Nazis. 400 to 500 Germans deserted the 999 battalions in Greece, mostly, though not exclusively, supporters of the KPD, who then worked with the partisans and, at least initially, the British forces against the Germans. My ebook includes biographies of a few of these brave comrades. Probably the best known is Wolfgang Abentroth, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, SAP, ex-KPD, who miraculously survived, became a well-known German left-wing historian and wrote about his experiences. Abentroth explains how the anti-Nazis' aim was to work, the German anti-Nazis' aim was to work with or alongside the Greek local population against the German troops. There were different ways of doing so, all dangerous. Many deserted to the partisans, but others supported them, the partisans clandestinely from within their army units. Abentroth, in fact, illustrates both. He first developed close contacts with the partisans while still working as a translator in the central office of the Nazi commander. He spoke about 4 languages and they just made use of him. Then he managed to escape to join Elas, the Greek People's Liberation Army. Elas was the military arm of the left-wing National Liberation Front, EAM, which was strongly influenced by the KKK, by the KKE, the Greek Communist Party, and the most popular guerrilla movement at that point. Elas was still working alongside the British, in effect SOE, for example, blowing up bridges, quite famous incidents of that, and in some armed confrontations with German troops. Abentroth was very critical of the KPD's alternative and rather chaotic attempts to set up separate communist guerrilla units. This stuff all gets very confusing. And I don't read Greek, but also there are many, many conflicting accounts of what's going on. But still, it seems a handful of German deserters directly joined the British forces, something most of the deserters condemned. Many years later, interviewed for German radio, Hans-Peter Klausch, another 999 deserter in Greece who joined the partisans, explained how the graves of the deserters from the 999s were still being decorated by the local people. Abentroth himself was reluctantly handed over by Elas to the British forces in 1944, who then sent him to a prisoner of war camp in North Africa. But he got out in 1946 and returned to Germany. But as we know, by the end of 1944, Elas was fighting against the British, and so were many of the deserters. How come these anti-Nazi Germans who had fought alongside British forces were willing to risk their lives in a war alongside Elas, where they came into conflict with British forces? To quote Burkhardt, one always has to be a bit careful with Burkhardt as a source, but still, to quote Burkhardt, by then the civilian agents of the British, by which he means SOE, tried to sabotage the plans of the German anti-fascists in particular and the partisans generally. What clearly emerges is that the anti-Nazi deserters had not fought with the partisans alongside the SOE because they were pro-British, but because they supported the fight against fascism. The tensions within British policy between being anti-fascist and pro-imperialist are sharply exposed during the Greek Civil War, when the German deserters who were fighting with the partisans along the British then fought with the partisans against the British. After British forces defeated Elas, about 500 German Elas fighters escaped to Albania and went over to their National Liberation Army. And I include 6 of their biographies. They're rather thin, but they're there. This is an almost unheard of story, including in Albania. Albania don't want to recognize them either. In addition, one unit of the 999 sent to Albania deserted en bloc, including the commander, someone called Zeb Moritz, who was an Austrian. At least a couple of the commanders, while remaining within the 999s, also actively collaborated with the partisans, providing them with food and ammunition. There were also deserters from the Wehrmacht proper. Indeed, so great was the level of desertion that in August 44, the partisans formed a specific unit for them. The partisans, mostly under the communist leadership of Enver Hoxha, numbered tens of thousands and had a remarkably high level of success against the German invaders. The first SOE mission, codenamed Consensus, arrived at the end of April 43. Unlike in Greece, the Communist Party, led by Hoxha, established at the end of 41, were deeply suspicious of the British and of the SOE. They noticed what had happened in Greece, as partly. The British might be fighting the same enemy, but their goals were at variance with the Albanians' resistance goals. Hoxha stated they could be used as a source of supplies, but for nothing more. But the British needed the assistance of the resistance movement, first against the Italians and the Germans. The SOE forces in Albania, for a variety of reasons, were more sympathetic to the communist partisans than in Greece. Between May 43 and the end of 44, SOE sent over 100 officers who successfully organized arms drops, funds and equipment, mostly parachuted into the partisans and joined in their attacks. The British government, on the other hand, remained deeply ambivalent, much to the annoyance of the SOE officers on the ground, who saw the right-wing Albanian groups as, in effect, siding with the Germans. Unlike in Greece, almost all the German deserters joined the partisans rather than forming separate communist-dominated units, and were involved in several bloody battles with German forces. Their histories are hard to find, but I did establish that they produced leaflets to distribute to the German troops. I'm just going to give one example, largely drawn from Abentroth. Paul Ludwig, a carpenter and member of the Communist Party, after many perilous adventures, he joined the International Brigades, fled to France. France extradited him back to Germany, who imprisoned him for 3 years and then sent him to the 999s in Albania, where he defected to the partisans. Hammaker, a source whose veracity I cannot vouch for, has Ludwig working in Albania for SOE. Somehow Ludwig then got to Moscow and fought with the Red Army. Back in East Germany, he did well in the police and died in 1992. In fact, quite a lot of these people joined the East German police. These stories remind us that not all Germans were Nazis or colluded silently with the Nazis. Most of the refugees included in my books have received little recognition because in part their earlier courage as active anti-Nazis in Germany were rarely acknowledged in Britain, partly because national myths do not generally focus on transnational fighters, and partly because so many were socialists, which during the Cold War was hardly popular. The UK does not come well out of this story. British troops played an important role in defeating Nazism, but the British government were involved in two parallel wars. The first was to defeat Nazi Germany, but the second, as exemplified by Greece, the second was to stop the Soviets and to preserve or build their own sphere of influence and control, which then led them into conflict with the anti-Nazi forces. My ebook attempts to remind us of the thousands of extraordinary German socialists who in different and often dangerous forms attempted to carry on the struggle against Nazism, even after they had become exiles, and looks at their shifting alliances, their shifting alliance with Britain, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you.